Hello, I'm Anawiltus, and today I want to discuss the big switch, the party switch that allegedly happened in the United States in the second half of the 20th century between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And a lot of this narrative particularly focuses on the southern states and the idea that the South as a region gradually became more Republican during this time period. And in order to analyze this, I have put together some data on the electoral histories of a number of different states, particularly um, 12 southern states. So that's all of the former Confederate states, and I've also added in Oklahoma as well. And I have, in order to balance this, also included 9 states that during the time period beginning at 1950 were majority Republican in order to give a sample balancing out our understanding of the switch and understanding whether the switch happened and in what way it happened. So I would say that when we're talking about a party switch, there are 4 different ways that a party can switch. One is the geographic switch, which is the one that is most discussed, where people take a look at, for example, maps of the presidential elections, and they'll show which president won which states, and then they'll show maps of different years, and they'll show the geography switching around. So the geographic control, the local allegiance to certain parties changing. Another switch is the politicians themselves switching parties, and we know that this did happen, uh, where politicians would uh, be members of one party, then switch to other parties. And this doesn't just happen from Democrats to Republicans during this period. This happens from Republicans to Democrats. It happens between various independent parties, but that's not something that we are analyzing here today. Right here, I'm mostly focusing on switches as occurring in state levels. So that's what we are looking at, the elections in states and which types of politicians the people in those states are electing. Uh, and another element of a switch would be the allegiance of the voters themselves. So the voters themselves, if they change their opinion on something, they could switch to voting for a different party. And this can happen uh, very quickly because of a particular issue that is important, or it can happen over a long period of time as generations replace each other. And the fourth type of switch would be an ideological switch, where parties switch ideologies. And that's also not something that this information is going to help you to analyze. So, what we are primarily analyzing here is the geographic allegiance. So, the information here, as it is laid out, is based on even numbered years, and the information is to determine where a majority was achieved in a 2 year period beginning with that year. So 1950, it means 1950 and 1951. And at the end of that 2 year period is where we're cutting it off and we're looking at who was winning. So in the case of presidential elections and some governorships, the winner is carried over from the previous 2 year period because the elections only happen every 4 years. And the reason it's structured like this is because in American election cycles, congressionally speaking, there's the election in the even numbered years, but the actual congressional session begins in the odd numbered year. So this is focusing on the election cycle and the subsequent uh, year in which the person was elected. However, in the case of some state governments that elect on odd numbered years and begin offices on even numbered years, the person who is counted as having won the election is counted as having won it in the even numbered year. So the point is that whoever at the end of 1951 is the winner gets into the 1950 category. Just like, for example, George W. Bush won the presidential election of the year 2000 and became the president in 2001, and so by the end of 2001, he was the president. This also means that very brief terms in which perhaps more than one person came into office and was replaced during that short time period, we are only counting the status at the end of the time period. So if, let's say, in the state of Alabama, there had been a Republican governor in 1953, but only in 1953, and he was replaced by the end of 1953 by another Democrat, then that obviously isn't going to show up here. Also, in the case of situations where there is a chamber, such as the state senates and houses, that has a mixed electorate where there is no clear majority, a mixed membership, no clear majority. I will count it as mixed even if there is a plurality that is on one side, and even if there is a speaker or president of that body that is appointed to lead on a certain party, in which case the party does have the advantage in the vote. I'm only counting the majority if it is based on the actual members of that chamber. So to describe the symbols that we're using and the color codes, R is for Republican and is shaded red, as is the more recent custom. D is for Democrat. It's shaded a light shade of blue, a cyan. Included in Democrat, we are including the 1960 opposition to JFK in a couple of states that where the electors chose to vote for Democrats who were not on the ticket, but were still Democrats. So they are included in that. And third parties are and unaffiliated politicians are shown in yellow. And when there is a no clear political majority, it is shown in magenta. So in Alabama, for example, some third parties, we have the SRD, States Rights Democratic Party, which in some ways could be considered a split-off group from the Democrats in 1948 that eventually rejoined the Democrats. And there's the American Independent Party, which also had a Southern Democrat affiliation, largely speaking. And there are some independents in some places, and the unicameral Nebraska legislature in this time period had no party affiliation. And I don't think that there's any other third party that is particularly relevant. But anyway, let's actually get into looking at the data. So, Alabama. Did a party switch occur in Alabama in the second half of the 20th century? Well, at the beginning, Alabama, as with all of the 12 southern states that I've shown on here, is Democratic. And in the 60s, we see in the Goldwater election, they chose to vote for Goldwater as president. However, and they also had a Republican majority in their delegation to the U.S. Congress. By the way, these are the delegations to the U.S. Congress. So on the federal level, the senators, it's always going to be two for each state, and the representatives, which of course is apportioned based on the acts of Congress. But in the case of Alabama, they had a brief Republican majority in their delegation, but then they continued to be Democratic until the mid 80s. Actually, in the representatives, both on the federal and state level, they continued to be Democratic until the 90s. And even in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, the House, state, and governor of Alabama were still Democratic. Now, to put this into perspective, we have to understand that the Jim Crow laws were mostly state-based laws and local laws, which means that if we understand American politics, we have to say that the federal policies and the state policies are going to be different because the two levels of government have different roles. So the reason why Alabama might vote for Republicans on the federal level, but vote for Democrats on the state level, is because the policies that they're dealing with are different. And I'm not saying that Alabama still had segregation in this time period in the 2000s, but I think it is an interesting case study that shows that although Alabama and some other states in the South began voting for Republicans, they eventually, many of them in many places, continued to vote for Democrats as representatives and in their own state governments for a lot longer than they were than they switched in the presidential level. So, of course, in 68, they chose to vote for the pro-segregation American Independent Party against Nixon and the Democratic Party candidate of that time, which is another thing to note, is that in this time period when the Southern strategy, as it is called, was beginning to be used, and there's debates as to how much it was used and as to which politicians were using it. But in this time period, there was still a very strong Democratic support. Now, what we see is all across the board, after Nixon had won his second term and he went out of office and Ford came in, the Republicans were very unpopular throughout the country. And of course, Jimmy Carter was a Southerner, and a Democrat. So all across the board in almost every state, of course, not as much in the more heavily Republican states, Jimmy Carter was elected over the Republican Party candidate Ford of the time. But of course, in the 80s, we see the Reagan coalition build up after some heavy criticism of the Ford administration. And also the Senate of Alabama, the senatorial delegation of Alabama switches to Republicans in the 90s. Now, based on this, did a party switch happen in Alabama, geographically speaking? I would say only halfway. And on that halfway, in the less significant half, and that is the federal level. It happened on the federal level, but on the state level, the Democrats continued to dominate into the Bush presidency, which is then beyond the time period that we're talking about. And we see a somewhat similar story with Arkansas, where in Arkansas, the Democrats continued, they initially had a very large dominance. Now, Arkansas wasn't in support of Strom Thurmond or the Dixiecrats in the 60s. However, they did end up joining that side in the later 60s. But they had a relatively strong Democratic domination throughout their history. And we see in their House delegations to the U.S. Congress, they had a more mixed support starting in the 70s. But as we see in their state government, the Senate and House continue to remain Democratic, and in fact, the House of Representatives switched back to being majority Democratic following the 2000 election. That is to say, the delegation of Arkansas. Even though the Republicans had won the governorship as well as the majority of electors for president. Now, I want to make something else clear. Both parties operated in these states throughout this time period, and even if there wasn't a majority, there was a significant Republican minority during this whole period in all of these southern states. But essentially, my verdict on Arkansas is that a geographic party switch did not happen in Arkansas until after the beginning of the new millennium. Florida is a different story. Florida started out Democratic, very strongly Democratic, until the 80s, where we see on the federal level, they started switching to Republican, especially in the late 80s in their congressional delegation. And it is in the 90s, in what some people call the Gingrich Revolution. You could say that the Gingrich coalition that in the later half of the Clinton presidency, in reaction to policies of Clinton, that the Republicans began getting the majority on the state government of Florida, and eventually we see Jeb Bush coming into office as governor of Florida. But another thing I want to mention is that, nationally speaking, until the 90s, throughout this whole time period, the Democrats actually had the majority in the House of Representatives of the United States. So the Republicans were the less popular party overall throughout the country. So a lot of these support for Republicans that led to the later equalization that we see in the 90s would obviously have to come from some Democratic supporters or a new generation coming into politics. Or perhaps politicization and grassroots movements, getting people that were previously apolitical to be more political. That's another option, of course. Georgia, very Democratic throughout the 50s, even in the 60s, the 70s. And once again, we see that they voted for Republican presidents, but everywhere else they remained Democratic, even into the 80s. And it's only in the 90s when, on the federal level, they began voting more Republican, but still on the state level, they remained strongly Democratic. So Florida, party switch in the 90s. Georgia, if a party switch happened, it happened after 2000. Louisiana supported Strom Thurmond in the 1948 election. and was relatively strongly Democratic. We see a somewhat similar story to Alabama and Arkansas and Georgia once again in Louisiana, where they had some Republican governors, and in the 90s, their representatives became majority Republican, but the both chambers in the state solidly Democratic throughout this entire 50-year period, or 52-year period, actually. So the party switch, if it happened in Louisiana, it happened after 2000. Um, I I think Louisiana is a more democratic state anyway. Um, I'm not actually looking at what happened after 2000 here. Mississippi, Democrats in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and in the 90s we see some greater support for the Republicans, but going back to the Democrats by the year 2000 mostly. So once again, not a party switch geographically happening here. And this is why I say that the presidential maps are somewhat misleading. It's because if you look at all these other uh, elections, you see a very different story. And that's because the president, since it's a single seat, the presidency, and it's a single seat with the largest constituency, which is the entire country, the presidency is the one person who is most likely to be a compromise candidate. It is the one person that people are most likely to compromise on when voting. Similar to the governor as well. If there's a disagreement here or there, the president and the governor are the people who people are most likely to compromise on because they have a larger constituency, which means they represent a greater variety of people, and also because therefore, since it is less local, it less represents the particular interests of the people, and also it's not a legislative office. The presidents and the governors, they don't make laws, or at least they're not supposed to. What they do is they implement laws made by the legislature, and they have some discretionary power over that. But the actual laws are supposed to be made by the legislatures, and that's why the legislatures are actually much more important for understanding the party switch, especially the representatives, because they really get to the smallest degree here. And by the way, I'm not showing the exactly by how much people had a Democratic majority or a Republican majority, because when we're talking about the question of the party switch, whether the party switched, what matters is if a switch happened, not if they slowly went up or slowly went down in popularity over time. Because of course that actually feeds more into the Republican narrative if we showed that. Um, but I'm primarily looking at whether they switched. That is a binary. Did they switch allegiance? Yes or no? So I cannot say that it happened in Mississippi. North Carolina. North Carolina, until the late 60s, very Democratic. Then they started electing Republicans. Richard Nixon here. Then Carter once again. Of course, Ford was not very popular after what happened with Nixon. And then Reagan and solidly Republican in the presidency to Bush. In their senatorial delegation, they were mixed in the senators that they brought to office, although they ended up being more heavily Republican as time passed. And on the national level, in the 90s, once again, time of Gingrich, they became more Republican. Although in '96, the Republicans did not manage to have a majority in the delegation. A brief domination by the Republicans in the House of North Carolina, but eventually switched back to Democratic dominance by the time of Bush. So, uh, so once again, partial, not complete. Oklahoma, similar story. Oklahoma is a bit different from the other states because these other states were actual members of the Confederacy, and while Oklahoma was a territory at the time, uh, it was the one territory that was most strongly associated with the Confederacy. And the reason I'm putting Oklahoma here and not um, the Arizona and New Mexico is because Arizona and New Mexico actually had a more uh, a stronger history of voting Republican before the New Deal coalition. And what all these states have in common here that I'm looking at is that they were very democratic before the New Deal coalition, in which essentially the entire country became democratic. And then democratic popularity was in a slow decline from the 50s to the 90s uh, as the Republicans throughout the country became more popular. Um, but these were countries that, states that voted Democratic before the New Deal coalition. And that's why they're particularly important. Now, I could have put the border states, but once again, with the border states, they also have a more mixed history. And what I'm looking at is states that are more solid in their allegiance, because that's what's most important for determining the party switch. Because if you have a state that's already a purple state, then it's hard to really argue that there's a party switch going on there. But you have to look at more solid states in order to determine whether a party switch happened. So Oklahoma, eventually the senatorial delegation became more Republican starting in the 60s, and their House delegation became more Republican. But what matters most, the state Senate and state House remained Democratic uh, into the Bush era. Tennessee, similar story once again. Started voting for more Republican presidents, actually voted Democratic in 64. Mostly Democratic in the other offices. There was a brief time of Republican resurgence in the 70s for Tennessee, and also a little bit in the 80s, but all of this really happened in the 94 election. Most of this. In the 94 election, they got back, the Republicans got the senatorial delegation and the representatives and the governorship. Of course, once again, Senate and House in the state remained Democratic. So it's hard to argue that a party switch happened there. Now, South Carolina is a bit different because in South Carolina, we actually see a party switch, but once again, we see it happen most heavily in the 90s, where we see the representatives, both in their delegation to U.S. Congress as well as their own House, becoming Republican, and this is the home state of I think it's Strom Thurmond, who was the leader of a SRDP in 48 and was a Democratic senator who eventually switched to Republican. But it's worth noting in this whole time period, the other senator is Democratic, and senators are typically elected uh, by the popular vote throughout the state, which means that the general population was willing to vote for a former Democrat, Strom Thurmond, who was a Republican now, as well as a Democrat consistently, and it was the same Democrat for most of his period as well. So the question is, did the Republicans and Democrats rise in popularity as their own terms were beginning to end? Or did people mostly vote for Thurmond and his opponent because of personal loyalty to the candidate, which is a possible reason? Or was Thurmond considered to not be a real Republican? Now, I don't know the answer to this, but it is interesting that they consistently voted for a Democrat and a Republican in this time period, while also throughout most of this time period, mostly voting for Democrats in most other places until the 90s hit, of course. And Texas, Democratic, like most places. And then the 90s hit, and still Democratic in the representatives they sent to the federal level, but Republican in the state house from 98. So this is interesting. You could argue that a party switch did happen in Texas a bit earlier than some of these other states that switched in the 2000s. Just like a party switch happened in South Carolina a bit earlier than those other states. But the point here that I'm making is that some of these states switched, but they didn't switch in the 60s and 70s so much as they did in the 90s. And many of these states, although they may have voted for Republicans on the federal level, continued to vote for Democrats on the state level into the 2000s, indicating that the switch was not complete by that time period, and that the most fundamental issues, the issues that were closest to the people, that is, the issues with the smallest constituencies, were issues that continued to be dominated by Democrats in those states. Virginia, another state, Democratic most of his time period, became Republican on the federal level, starting in the late 60s, really the 70s. Although the Republicans lost influence in the 90s, early 90s, but then regained it by year 2000. So we see an interesting pattern where they almost switched in the 70s, then then went largely back in the 90s before switching again in the 2000s. And of course, Virginia, in some elections, is considered to be a swing state. Kansas. So now we're looking at 9 states that voted largely Republican in 1950, and these are actually the only 9 states that I found that on all 6 elections, of course, excepting Nebraska, voted Republican in these areas. And that's because, believe it or not, the Republicans were less popular in this time period, which is indicated by the fact that they didn't have a Speaker of the House in U.S. Congress for many decades. But anyway, Kansas. Did a party switch happen? It's pretty clear to see it didn't happen in Kansas. Because this is another issue here. The question of a party switch is, did the party switch happen, is not only a question as to whether it happened in the South, but whether it happened nationally. Because if you want to argue that the parties swapped, you also have to argue that if you argue that the parties swapped without the person's allegiances to particular policies swapping, then Kansas is really a counterexample to that, because it's It's a state that began solidly Republican in this time period and ended solidly Republican. Where there were, of course, some Democrats in between. Um, of course, Goldwater was extremely unpopular. Uh, and there's a number of reasons why he was unpopular. His opponents really played up his stance on being more open to using nuclear weapons in war. Uh, Another reason he was unpopular was he took a sort of early libertarian stance of of being strongly in favor of states' rights, even though he was a member of the NAACP and was opposed to segregation at a time period when the Civil Rights Act began to the 64 Civil Rights Act was being put through. He opposed it, even though he had supported previous Civil Rights Acts. So, so it's interesting. Goldwater. Some people characterize him as being a racist in that sense, although the evidence really shows that he was more a more hardcore liberal person who opposed the Civil Rights Act for different reasons than why a lot of the Southerners uh, opposed it in that time period. Although a lot of them still ended up voting for him simply because he was an opponent of it. But that's another story. Because then you can also talk about whether Reagan was dog whistling, and if he was dog whistling, whether he was actually privy to racist dog whistles, or you can get into a different question. Uh, because one thing that's interesting is people take certain policies and they say that these are policies that are racist policies that are then in later decades disguised to hide their racism in order to have a more popular public image. But an example of a policy like this would be marriage licenses. The question of marriage licenses. Very early on, marriage licenses were largely implemented with the idea of stopping interracial marriage. And that's why they were supported early on. However, nowadays, the reason people support marriage licenses is because the government gives special tax incentives to people who are married. You get special tax breaks. So a policy over time can be supported for different reasons. Just like Goldwater supported the opposition to the Civil Rights Act for a different reason than pro-segregationists did. There's people nowadays supporting marriage licenses for a different reason than a lot of the early implementers did. Or people can oppose busing, okay, for different reasons than pro-segregationists oppose busing. And I think that that's something that is lost on a lot of people. A lot of people consider that because a leadership of a certain group is opposing a policy and they have a very unpopular reason for opposing it, and therefore they disguise it by putting out a different reason, people assume that the different reason is completely unrelated to it, when in fact, it's very easy. If you're supporting a policy, it's very easy to find different reasons to support a policy, even if your primary reason is lost on certain people. Those people can still support the policy for different reasons. So, so I think that that's one thing. And another thing to note here is that the political issues at the beginning and end of this period are very different. Very few people in the year 2000 were talking about bringing back segregation or segregating schools or doing a number of different things. So the party switch, as it happened, and as it didn't happen in some places, is it should be understood as happening in relation to a number of other things that were happening at the same time. And that is that policies gradually shift over the years. And if you know anything about the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, you would know that neither party has a an ideological manifesto of what the party is solidly for and against. Neither party has a coherent ideology. They're both big tent parties that exist largely to oppose whatever policies are being debated in the public discourse. So if X policy is debated in the public discourse, generally speaking, one party will support it and one party will oppose it. And if that issue disappears and a new issue arises, they will find new positions on those. So they don't have a coherent ideology, which I think is actually a very valid criticism against both parties, that they don't have a coherent ideology. And another issue here is that even though they don't have a coherent ideology, they also don't have a unified plan on what they want to do. The plans that these parties propose are typically very limited in their ability to bind members of that party to those plans, and therefore anybody can be a Republican and anybody can be a Democrat, and it's very hard to kick people out of these parties. So what I'm essentially saying here is that politics change over time, and the parties also change over time, and the parties, the changes that the parties undergo don't really have any coherent order to them other than the spirit of the time in general. And another thing that's not really looked at here is migration, whether that be immigration from other countries and also cross migration across the United States. Because in the South, you could argue that Democrats in the South were slowly becoming more Republican as this time period happened. But you could also argue that in this time period, air conditioning became much more viable as a technology and much more affordable and available, that a lot more people moved to the South, and the South's population really began to explode in this time period. Because one of the reasons why people were bringing slaves into the South in the first place in the 1600s and 1700s is because the area was relatively inhospitable to people that were more accustomed to a temperate climate as opposed to the subtropical climate that is present throughout a lot of the South. So, uh, so that's what made slaves from Africa in particular attractive to these people as a workforce, is because they were individuals who were more used to a similar climate and therefore had a greater resistance to a number of diseases that were more common in those regions of the world. Now, I'm not justifying what happened. I'm trying to explain the population shifts in the South, why there were a lot of slaves in the South, uh, and also why a lot of people eventually moved to the South when those issues became less relevant. As medical technology advanced, a lot of those diseases became less common, and eventually air conditioning made the South a much more livable place for people that were more accustomed to colder climates. And so a lot of people moved to the South in the latter half of this time period, in the later years of the 20th century. So uh, that's another alternative for explaining why more Republicans appeared. Now, I'm not saying that Democrats didn't become Republicans, as there were many Democrats that became Republicans, as there were Republicans that became Democrats in this time period. Uh, But what I'm explaining here is that there's a whole lot of different factors that you don't really get to see if you only look at the maps of presidential elections. So, moving on, I took way too long a tangent on Kansas here. But essentially, the party switch didn't happen in Kansas. Maine, a more Republican state in the 50s, had some Democratic gains later 50s and in the 60s became Democratic, but not fully. It retained a lot of Republican support in the state, and then in the 70s it became a lot more Democratic, but on the federal level, Republicans continued to dominate uh, until the 90s, when both on the federal and state level, the Democrats dominated. So what we see is that there was a party shift here, a party switch. Uh, it happened in the 60s, but then reverted largely uh, before slowly happening in the 80s and then really going full swing again in the 90s, like the switches in a lot of the southern states. Uh, of course, by then, the issues that were being discussed were quite different from the issues at the beginning of this time period. Um, Nebraska, very Republican in the 50s. The Nebraska legislature is unicameral, and in this time period, there were no official party affiliations for Nebraska politicians. Although, looking at some of the leaders of their legislature, they did lean very heavily Republican, as these people ended up later on becoming Republican politicians in other places, particularly going to the federal level. So in the 50s, there was a slight upswing in Democrats, late 50s, early 60s, but the state remained pretty Republican. And on the federal level, it continued to be very Republican, with some Democratic senators making gains and occasionally having Democratic governors. But still, by the Bush administration, it was not quite as Republican as it had been in 1950, but still very Republican. So a party switch did not happen in Nebraska. New Hampshire, somewhat similar story to Kansas. Very Republican in the 50s. Slight Democratic upswing in the 60s, but remaining pretty solidly Republican into the Bush administration. So party switch did not happen in New Hampshire in this time period. New Jersey, 1950, very Republican, but the Democrats started making gains by the late 50s and really dominated the mid 60s. But eventually, the Republicans made a comeback in the late 60s and early 70s before the Democrats became dominant in the 70s and in part of the 80s, in which the Republicans became more popular again, until the 90s, in which the Republicans became big, although they eventually lost influence on the federal level, but retained it on the state level. So, did a party switch happen in New Jersey? No. Oregon, somewhat similar story. Republicans were pretty dominant, but then the Democrats became more popular in the later 50s. But the Republicans became more popular in the late 60s, before the Democrats in the early 70s. And then in the 90s, the Republicans began making some gains, but once again, only a partial switch, like New Jersey. Pennsylvania, Republicans were pretty strong. Once again, in the middle, they became a lot less popular, and towards the end, they became more popular. And this is an interesting coincidence that we see, is that we see a somewhat similar pattern in some of the Democratic states where in the 70s, the Democrats actually make a big comeback. And I think that this is a more nationwide phenomenon. Of course, the exception being Virginia, where it became very strongly Republican in this time period, at least on the federal level. But South Dakota, very strongly Republican at the beginning of the period. 70s, more Democratic support, and then back to being strongly Republican by the Bush presidency, with, of course, Democratic senators. And Vermont, Republican throughout most of its early history, even going into the early 80s, before it in the mid 80s becoming more Democratic. Late 80s, they were fully Democratic on their state government, in majority, that is. And eventually, the independent here, that's Bernie Sanders. Uh, they, as they had one representative in this time period, uh, and were mixed on a senatorial level. But they became much more democratic, although the Republicans actually managed to gain the House back at the end of this period. But anyway, in total, I would say that there are some states that you can argue switched, okay, in this time period. But there are a lot of other states that switched a lot later than this time period, switched into the early 2000s or even after that. And there are many states, uh, places like Kansas, that didn't switch at all. So this really makes me question whether the geographic party switch actually happened, because a lot of the predictions that you would expect uh, to occur, that these states were very solidly Republican, just aren't true. For example, Alabama, still Democratic in its state government by the Bush presidency. And you would expect that if a party switch happened, that the more heavily Republican states would become Democratic, and some of them did. Where you see Maine is one that did, um, and Vermont, but a lot of them did not in this time period. So what this indicates, and we also see that the southern states that became Republican mostly became Republican in the 90s. So this indicates that the party switch happened a lot later than a lot of people are implying, and that at least geographically speaking, and what it also indicates is that it didn't happen everywhere. So, for example, the states on the Great Plains, people call it the flyover country. These places remained relatively Republican. So we look at South Dakota, we look at Nebraska, and we look at Kansas. These were states that were Republican, and they continue to be Republican today for the most part. And you can't really argue that there was a switch, and they don't have a history with the Confederacy. So there's something wrong about the narrative of a switch. Now, I'm not saying that no switch happened, because obviously there were politicians who did switch. Obviously, there were regions that did switch allegiance. I'm not saying that that didn't happen. What I am saying is that a lot of this happened after a national consensus uh, arose over civil rights issues. So, it happened after people stopped caring about segregation. Uh, Nowadays, the Democrats probably care more about segregation if you look at safe spaces and things like that. but that's a whole different kind of segregation. So here's something I will say. I don't think it's fair to call the Democrats the party of the Confederacy and the KKK. And the reason that's not fair is because there were a lot of Northern Democrats in that time period and afterward who were anti slavery and who were anti segregation, especially if you understand that I had previously done studies on third parties in the United States, that the Democrats and Republicans, in order to maintain their political dominance, had to absorb third parties that emerged. For example, there was the People's Party that emerged, and that was absorbed by the Democrats. So they had this more labor oriented side to their party that existed more largely in the North and in the West, and also uh, was very instrumental in the New Deal coalition. So, calling the Democrats the party uh, of segregation and the KKK and the the Civil War, the secession that is partially accurate because most of the people that were involved there were Democrats, but it's not accurate to how the party operates today, or even it, it, it's only locally accurate to the party in those areas where those things happened. I think that's a better way to put it. Just like the Republicans, they had a presence in those areas, and in many of these southern states, early on, people could get lynched for being Republicans. So, uh, but what we see is that though there might have been some Republicans who tried to exploit the racial attitudes of Southerners in order to gain votes, especially on the presidential level, we see that if they did this on the state level, it probably wasn't very successful. And by the time that those issues stopped being important to people, that's that's when they started gaining popularity, because this is a 52-year period and people live and die in this time period. Now, there's a lot of people that live longer than that, but there's people that entered adulthood and voted for the first time in 1948. They might have voted for Strom Thurmond, and then they might be dead by the time that the Republicans really make gains in the 90s. So, my point is that the switch happened in some places, it didn't happen everywhere. But the fact that it didn't happen globally in the South, uh, but when I say globally, I mean perhaps a better word would be universally. It didn't universally happen throughout the South. Uh, in the time period when it would have been important to have happened, according to the ideological narrative of the party switch, because I think this largely debunks that. Because if that were true, then that would mean that the people in Kansas suddenly became a lot more racist throughout this time period, whereas the people in Florida continued to be equally racist during this time period, even though Florida probably saw a lot more immigration during this time period. Um, it, the more you look into it, the less it makes sense. Now, that's not denying that people didn't switch parties. Sorry, that people switch parties. I'm not denying that. I'm not denying that geographically states switched allegiances. What I am denying is that this happened in the 60s and 70s, because looking at the data, it obviously didn't. What I am also denying is that this was a country, a, a party wide affair, that the whole party switched, because looking at Kansas and New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, South Dakota, um, and other places, Nebraska, that's obviously not true. So this should seriously pose questions to people that favor the switch narrative, because looking at the data, this is data that they have to now develop a model to explain. They have to develop a model to explain why the switch happened in some states, uh, in and why it happened in the 90s and not in earlier time periods, because they typically only looked at the presidential election, and that's where they come up with this idea. And also, why in some places where the switch happened, it happened a lot later than the 90s, and why in some places it didn't happen at all. If the idea is that in general the parties switched ideologies, that would not make sense. So what makes a lot more sense is a model that looks at changing issues over time and also generational shifts. So the issues change as time passes because the parties aren't monolithic, and also new generations arise that value different things. And there's migration in the country, especially in Florida. I live in Florida. I know this. There's a lot of Northerners that move to Florida. So it makes sense why the South would become more Republican if people from the North began moving more towards the South. That's another issue. And I'm not saying that accounts for all of it. I'm not saying that anything I'm saying accounts for everything. What I am saying is that these are all little parts of the puzzle that you have to put together to have a more holistic understanding of what actually happened. So tell me what you think in the comments section below. Do you support the idea of a great switch? Are you vehemently opposed? By the way, I'm not vehemently opposed. I'm just saying that there's a lot more issues that people aren't looking at. Uh, Although I am opposing the narrative that it was a specifically countrywide switch, because that's obviously false based on the data I've collected, uh, and and the idea that the switch happened before the 90s, uh, be, because that's also something that the data I've collected shows is clearly false. Uh, those are two ideas that I think I can say are definitively disproven. But tell me what you think in the comments section below. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think that there's another factor that should be looked at in this conversation? Do you think that we should now do a study on all the different politicians in these states and what years they switched parties, and the rate at which party switches happened in certain time periods for politicians? That might be another interesting study to look at. But tell me what you think in the comments section below, and I will be seeing you all next time on Awiltus. Over and out.